Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first thank the Child Development Center for this opportunity to interact with you. I've always been privileged to interact with a group of pediatricians and sometimes pediatric neurologists in the past 15 years. I would place on my record my appreciation for Dr. M.K.C. Nair, who probably brought me into this context, and Dr. Babu George for having continuously given me this opportunity. I think we have not have been able to interact with each other for a while, but this has been a great privilege. And I'm apologetic on the note that we had to do this recording. I have an urgent meeting. For that very reason, we're doing this recording. So what I plan to do is I would make a presentation for about an hour and a half, maybe 90 minutes, following which I'll come back once the presentation is over to address to your questions. Okay, in this presentation, what I plan to do is basically introduce to you the various theories in terms of psychosocial theories for about human development. And by perhaps taking a view at these theories, you would probably have contesting, vying perspectives far removed from what we call the physiological perspectives. So I think this should be of interest to many of you who have been preoccupied with treatment, and also some of you who probably had forayed into psychology or even sociology. But all the same, I think that this is of very specific importance in understanding, and especially when you have to deal with the family as a system and the client system. So in that way, I think we would be able to together discover another perspective to human development. Now, I would probably start with a slide share here, and we will look at the different theories that we would like to share. Let me start from the beginning. So as I said, we will start with what is developmental psychology and go on to what we call the theories of human development. So let's move on. First, I would like to introduce what developmental psychology is, a branch of psychology. As you know, psychology is the study of the human mind and behavior, as well as the higher order mental processes. Now, subsequent to its evolution in the 1940s, there was an interest in child development and on the larger perspective on human development. And so there was one branch of psychology that basically dealt with human development, and that's what we call developmental psychology. And one of the pioneers in this particular discipline was Elizabeth Hurlock, and she has described development psychology as a branch of psychology that studies the intra-individual changes and the inter-individual changes happening within this intra-individual changes. So it's largely about the intra-individual changes, the changes happening within the individual. And subsequent to that, it looks at how the individual or the changes within the individual takes place within the perspective of the gradual interactions that the human being or the human organism develops with this environment. So in this particular branch of psychology, we deal largely by looking at the biophysical, psychological, and social basis of human behavior right from birth till death. So it's a perspective from womb to tomb on these three dimensions: the biophysical, the psychological, and the social dimension. Now, moving on to the next perspective, I must tell you about some facts regarding development. To start off, I should say that development is, to begin with, antagonistic, because it starts the moment you are born. There's a clock ticking, a countdown starts, and you're going on to death. So it involves two things. There is an evolution in terms of human being changing, but there's also a process of involution where you lose your energy, and gradually, just like the sun going through atrophy, you gradually disintegrate. So there's a process that happens simultaneously with you living. There is a death happening. You're moving slowly closer to death. So in that way, it is antagonistic. And essentially, the foundations that you lay before in each stage has a consequence on the next few stages that are subsequent to it. So human development needs to be looked in terms of the gradual evolution, which is built on foundations. Now, it is essentially driven by the manifestation of the human potential, the genetic disposition, or the things manifesting. And this genetic manifestation, in terms of our characteristics in physiological aspects as well as the behavioral aspects, tend to interact with the environment. And through this interaction with the environment, through the constant process of adaptation to the changes, there happens a learning. So development happens due to the interaction between the maturation with the environment as a result of learning. And as all of you would know, essentially it follows a definite pattern. It follows the cephalocaudal pattern, which is from the head to the toes. It is direction from the top to the foot, and also from the center to the extremities, which we call proximodistal. So cephalocaudal and proximodistal are the two dimensions along which the human development takes place. And as we go on, we must understand that it is essentially individualistic. It differs from person to person. And also, as we say, read someone down there, it depends on the environment, the stimulation that person receives. And we would also witness the changes in development as state of disequilibrium, and then subsequently followed by equilibrium. For instance, when you think about the fusion of the sperm and the ovum, it develops into zygote, and the subsequent development is very, very explosive. It happens in 9 months from 2 cells or 1 cell to a large number of cells, and ultimately a huge human organ, human body, which we call the fetus, and eventually the baby. So it's a very fast development in its first 9 months. And subsequent to that, after delivery, there is a plateau. So there's a stage of rapid development and suddenly a slowing down or a standstill. The same thing happens also during puberty. So there is this state of equilibrium followed by a stage of disequilibrium, or vice versa. And each stage has its own definite challenges, which we call hazards. Okay. And definitely all these changes, as we said earlier, is moderated by the cultural situation. So there are cultural differences that bring in or encourage certain sort of development, but curtail the other types of development. And moving on to the stages as defined by Havelock again, Havelock gives or gave a lot of importance to the prenatal phases, which I think is of relevance now in terms of what we call epigenetics. We'll come to that later, followed by the infancy stage, which is the first 2 weeks, during which we have 2 substages: the partunate, the stage during which the baby is delivered or is born out of its mother's body. After post-delivery, until the time the umbilical cord is severed, we call it a partunate. For the first 15 to 30 minutes, during which we wait for the umbilical cord to be severed, is called the partunate stage, beyond which, after being severed, the baby is called a neonate. So for the first few 15 minutes to 30 minutes to the first 2 weeks of life. That's for the transformations about first, followed by babyhood from the age until about 2 years or 3 years. Largely, there are different ways in which you look at it. There's no absolute way of differentiating, but we call it generally babyhood is the age at the time the baby starts to walk or maybe run a bit. And following which you have the childhood, which is in 2 phases, between 3 to 5, which we call the preschool stage as early childhood, and the school age from 5 to 10, which we call the late childhood. This is followed by a rapid development, the physiology, as all of you know, the puberty, the first 3 years of the leading to adolescence, during which rapid physical changes and sexual changes also manifest. And then we call it adolescence between 13 and 18. And beyond 18, you call the person an adult or youth, as we call these days, between, let's say, 19 and 40 or 19 and 35, it depends on different systems. But largely, we call adulthood as the age during which people get married, settle at work, etc. Beyond which, beyond 40 or 45, we call it middle age until 60 years. And beyond 60 years, we call it late adulthood. But I would say these are very tentative classifications based on the industrial society, because if you look at the present day, I don't think many of us retire. I don't think that many of our parents who are agriculturists or who are vendors on the streets, they still continue to live beyond their 80s on the streets working. So there's probably a cultural element to classification in this manner. I would like to refer to epigenetics, because there was a time in which I used to I used to discuss with one of my close friends, a psychiatrist in Toronto. And I always believe when I examined clients who had suicidal ideations, uh, they always used to say, there's nobody to love me. So when you ask them, when you confront them still further, generally confront, they'll come up with a lot of explanations to the effect that say, there's nobody to love me in this world. When I say the world, I always assume it's the first world, because I see a lot of association between unwantedness during pregnancy and the subsequent manifestation of suicidal ideations. But all the same, I think the present system in psychiatry does acknowledge the fact that maternal stress during pregnancy can lead to severe mental issues when the child emerges into the child's the early childhood or even adolescence. So there are indications to this effect. We will probably debate on that later. Now, I wish to introduce you again to this concept called developmental tasks. Now, this concept of developmental task was introduced by Havighurst, and Havighurst has talked about a group of social expectations. Now, we described different stages as I did show you here. I'm sorry. Yeah, in this particular slide, we have different stages. So according to Havighurst, during each of these phases written, there are certain specific expectations. So he has rightly described it as development tasks as those tasks arising at or about a certain period in the life of an individual, the successful achievement of which leads to happiness and to success in the later tasks, while failure leads to unhappiness and difficulty in later tasks. So there are certain expectations that are put on the individual. Now, when I say expectations, it's very interesting, because the moment a child decides to, the child decides, for example, let's talk about a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. Often the parents ask them, or by the time they're 13, they ask them, what do you plan to do? And okay, what are you doing? And the next question that they do is like, when they've completed the 10th, they're asked, okay, what is your area of interest? Are you going to do law? Are you going to do engineering? Are you going to be a doctor, etc.? So there are demands on the child. So the child gives in and say, okay, I'm finally becoming one. And once they decide, they qualify and they pass the 10th, the next question is, okay, what are you going to do? What are your specific interests, or what are you going to do in terms of your subject specialization? So it's either commerce or humanities, or even science or maths, or whatever it is. So they are forced to, in a way, suggested or kind of forced to decide on what are their preferences. And the moment they appear for the 12th, they're asked, okay, what do you do next? And then they go in for some graduation, maybe in different of the specific disciplines. But once they finish their graduation, do you think those questions end? No. Once you finish graduation, the next question is, do you have a job yet? When do you get a job is the next question. So it goes on from there. And the moment you qualify for a job, the next question is, when do you get married? And if you thought that was the end of it, no, that's not the end of it. Beyond marriage, the question still continues. The person's ask you, okay, isn't it time we had a baby? So there are questions and a lot of classify as social expectations in what Havighurst calls developmental tasks. So that is what we meant by developmental tasks. Now let us quickly have a look at what are the developmental tasks at the various stages. So I'll again screen share. So what are the tasks basically? Quickly, we'll have a review of that. Basically, between the prenatal stages, with the babyhood and early childhood, the person or the individual is expected to do a lot of adjustments. For instance, shifting from liquid foods to solid foods, learning to talk, and maybe the first time the child uttered the word amma or ma, and then gradually picking on new words and becoming fluent in the conversation. The first step, or the time it turned over and started to crawl, and from crawling to standing up, all those transitions are expected. There's a family that largely conditions those changes. And it encourages, because the moment the child stands up or starts to walk, there's a clap from the family and the baby's encouraged to do so. So there are expectations being indirectly put to the child. Similarly, the child also experiences the pressures to control elimination in terms of bladder control and bowel control, that largely happens during the early childhood. And as I mentioned earlier, there are cultural differences. For example, we have the present trend where the parents drape the child with a diaper, and often we find that the elimination or the control or elimination gets delayed by, let's say, 6 months to 2 years. So there are cultural practices moderating this, but still I would say social expectations condition the child. So also gradually the child learns to differentiate between right and wrong. Next, during late childhood, as we know, they start to play, they interact with others, and they're gradually getting independence in terms of control over their bodies. So a sort of autonomy on the bodies. They exercise, they move their arms, they move their legs, they run and they throw. So there is this things, and also besides that, there is a constant demand to adjust with the peers from whom they also learn or get rudimentary understanding of the basic requirements regarding their own sex roles. And gradually they also learn to read and write and do arithmetic and things like that. And over a period of time, they develop a sense of identity in terms of being able to differentiate between right and wrong, and in a way develop what we call conscience. They also develop attitudes towards social groups, which are largely imposed by ideas or prejudices informed by the parents or their own peers. In which we have the stage called adolescence, during which obviously the child is now growing faster. There's a demand or an expectation on it in terms of accepting its body and using the body effectively. The child gradually learns to become emotional independence, and you'll find the first symptoms of the child rebelling with the parents, managing a career, and then preparing for a family and marriage and things like that. There is a kind of inclination. So there is an expectation where you expect girls or boys to behave in appropriate ways, especially with the sex roles coming in specifically. And by this time, the child also has certain a degree of ideologies. And beyond that, also they gradually discover socially appropriate behaviors, and also have perhaps relationship with the same age mates. So there's a peer group coming into play at this particular point, and which we call social expectations or developmental tasks. Moving ahead, when we come to adulthood, there is a demand in terms of independence, which comes through, of course, getting an occupation, finding an occupation, building a career, finding a mate, and from that, building a family, adjusting with that mate, having children, and often starting a home. So this is expected when you go towards adulthood. So whether you like it or not, you're forced to take certain positions, expectations largely conditioned by the society, and more specifically by the family. Moving on, we come to middle age, during which there is this stage when all of us tend to physically fail. Aging sets in a gradual way. There is a need, a compulsion to adjust to the failing physical self. And and topping on that, you have demands on the resources that you have, because when you age, gradually your resources shrink much more than you used to get during your adulthood. Your resources in terms of health is failing. Financial resources need to be shared with the children, taking care of grandparents or your own parents. And then you need to find, so that way there's a lot of demand in terms of them settling down their children, sending them off, getting them married. So that all requires money to be dispensed. And also there is a finding of your own personal leisure time. And also in a lot of cases, there is a rediscovery of relating better with the spouse, which we call companionate relationship. So from a romantic relationship that prevailed during adulthood, you're shifting to a more of a companionate sort of relationship. And also they gradually engage in civic engagements and social responsibilities. And you find in the next stage the real pinch of the health setting in, physical health failing, and then you are forced to retire, reducing substantially the income. So beyond that, there is little to fall back on. They also experience the loss of a spouse, which is most frequent after the 60s and 70s these days. And especially given that they have to move into smaller living engagements. So from a big car to a smaller car, from a large householding, from a big house to a smaller house, or eventually moving into an apartment. So these are the things that we are forced to undertake for societal pressures, as we say in terms of what we call the disengagement theory, when you are by the society expected to reduce your roles and confine yourself to flexible social roles. Let us move on to, so from the developmental task, I would like to first bring your attention to various theories. Now, we come across a set of theories, we are going to visit a set of theories which will give you a basic understanding of the larger perspective of human development. And I would start off with a couple of just one Indian theory to give you the understanding in terms of the Indian meaning of human development, or the Indian context of human development driven by Manodharma Shastra, followed by a perspective by the European German psychologist Bueller. We will revisit Freud, who happens to be the father of psychology and psychoanalysis. We look at Erik Erikson and also Piaget, and finally Kohlberg. So let's move on to those theories one by one. Let me start off with here with Manodharma Shastra. Okay. Now, Manodharma Shastra was based on the ideologies or the social structuring prescribed by Manusmriti and Manu, and it classifies life into 4 stages. The first stage being Brahmacharya Ashrama, in which we describe the situation until 14 years. So until about 14 years, the child is asexual, is moldable and ready to be taught and learn, willing to learn. So during that stage, basically the child is allowed to study, and the focus is then exclusively on collecting or gathering information for the future life. And this is often transacted in a Gurukula system, where you are in charge of 2 senior people who had substantial experience in their lives. So they are teachers who share their own experience with the children. So the children being asexual are programmed to learn. So this is exactly the expectation during adolescence, where you go to a Gurukula, you have a family living in terms of learning from them, doing the daily chores, helping them with the household things. So it's largely an engagement. And beyond that, when you move to the next stage of adulthood in the technical sense, you're becoming sexually mature, and you're allowed to indulge in the ways of the world in terms of sexuality, artha, earning, and then from there thriving, prospering. So there's this total immersion or engagement with the world and the worldly pleasures. And so I call it laugigada, getting involved with the world, attachment with the physical things or the physical realm of the world. Subsequent to that, you also have children, and then you progress in life. And you come to a stage which we call middle age, and that is a stage what we call from after Grihasthashrama, which I mentioned earlier. You move into a stage called Vanaprastha, where you become the teacher, because having gathered experience, having experienced the world, you have more to share. And there is this typical understanding of willingness to pay back, to give back to the society. So you take the role of a teacher, as I mentioned in the beginning. You will gather from your experience, share that with youngsters, as we said in the Brahmacharya Ashrama. So they will be in this Gurukula, and you'll be the teacher, and you will explain or expand, share your understanding about the world with them. And you should realize that they move from the central towns and cities to the peripheries, and that is what we call the Vanaprastha. You're moving towards the periphery, which we call the forest. So they're on the brink, away from civilization. And during the next stage, where you realize you're failing and your time's up, you go into the forest and allow yourself to disintegrate, in the sense maybe you'll be consumed by animals. Your willingness, like as we discussed in the case of samadhi, a lot of in the Indian culture, we have a way of ending our lives, which is considered also a kind of giving up. It's kind of considered a sacred context too. So we call it sannyasashrama, where you move from periphery into the forest and you're away from civilization totally. So these are the 4 phases according to Manudharma Shastra. And this is, I think, the only Indian kind of theory which I understand to describe the 4 phases of human development. From there, we will move on to the next theory. Let me have a look here. Yeah, the theory by Bueller. Now, Bueller has, I would say, from the simplicity of the Manusmriti or Manudharma Shastra, we find a little more complicated explanation for human growth and development. And this is by Bueller from 1933. Bueller talks about the first stage until 14 years, where he describes this as growth. There is physical, emotional, and mental growth happening. And there's this development, sudden burst of physiological development. And subsequent to that, between 14 and 24, this human being starts to explore beyond the family. It goes into the school, so it explores the society, and it sort of gathers a tentative decision about life, and maybe tries to gather enough resources to move on to the next phase. So which we call establishment. So between 25 and 45 years, this is what we call adulthood, during which the person establishes for himself or herself a career, establishes a family. So there is a kind of decision being made and stick on to something for a longer period of time. And as you move on further, between 45 and 60, as I told you earlier, you reach into middle age where your resources are gradually becoming strained for reasons of physical limitations, for reasons of work gradually becoming less remunerative. Not in the case of doctors, of course, in the general context, because your productivity is lower. So there's a need to sustain, and that is what Bueller called maintenance. And so a period of consolidation of whatever you have, but within the limitations, trying to enjoy what you've achieved. And finally, what we call decline, beyond which you fail physically and gradually lose your social contacts and mental abilities and gradually wither out. So there is this 5 stage of human development according to Bueller. Moving from Bueller, we come to the father of psychology, Sigmund Freud, a brilliant psychologist, a brilliant man. He was actually, if I remember correctly, a neurologist in practice in Austria. He had a strange fascination for the mind, because he had watched Charcot, and before Charcot, maybe Charcot had inherited this concept of being able to hypnotize and suggest things to people and influence the mind. Charcot especially was able to create or demonstrate hysteria, in the sense of hysteric blindness and hysteric paralysis. So he would create that in very normal people and subsequently reverse it. So there was a strong suggestibility, which I think Freud was fascinated with. And that led him to experiment with one single case. I think that his entire theory is based on a single case called Anna O. So being a genius in himself, he had classified, or through observation, said that there is this energy in all of us which we call eros. So there's libidinal energy, which is life energy, which is actually helping you to survive. And this life energy manifests at different zones in your body. So there's this erogenous zones which requires stimulation, according to Freud, not according to me, but according to Freud. And he said that during the first 1 year of your life energy or your erogenous zone is on your mouth. So there is a tendency of a child to put everything in its mouth, the nipple, picking up stones, the fingers, everything goes to the mouth because that's a pleasure area. And so what Freud explained is that if there is a reasonable satiation of that need, the child becomes happy. As we mentioned in the developmental tasks, the success in that leads to happiness, and the failure that leads to disappointment and adjustment, lack of adjustment to next stages. The same way, if you're not able to satisfy this, there's a fixation, unable to satisfy, because we all know that our parents, or you could observe people try to wean away their children using very, very drastic means, such as, trying to put on pepper on the nipple, or trying to put on very bitter, what we call juices, which would try often wean the child. But that sort of resistance that happens results in fixation. And that fixation can precipitate in issues such as smoking in the later stages, nail biting, according to Freud. So beyond that stage, after having settled with this, you move on to the next phase. So people who successfully complete that move on to the next phase, which Freud called the anal stage. Or in the anal stage, the child's basic erogenous zones becomes the anal area, largely referring to the bladder and bowel control. Because we have traditionally, I don't know how many of you have seen this, as children, unlike in my childhood where I had to do everything in a potty, we have in the villages grandmothers sitting their children on the lap, singing to them, telling them stories while they have the bowel. So there's less pressure on them to deliver on time. There is this gradual phase manner of managing, being able to control the bowels. Versus in real life, I have seen clients. I remember a client who refused to join a hostel at the age of 18. You know why? The only reason she could not join the hostel was the fact that she had she had enuresis. Okay, and then she could not control her secondary enuresis. She could not control her urination, and she would have bedwetting. So she could not move into the hostel. And I probed her life because I was a therapist myself for about 5 years. And when we found her childhood event in which her mother was a nurse in Bahrain, and she was somewhere in central Kerala, and the only airport was in Trivandrum, where I am stationed right now. And so the mother was eager, in a hurried manner, trying to leave for the airport. There was a time limit. And as the child was nearing the airport, she had the need to go to the toilet. And the mother was upset. She was first critical about the child, but then she let the child do it. But she could see herself standing there, and the flight getting ready to take off. Getting set, and she would look at the time, at the clock, at the watch, and the plane, and the child was like tense. She beat the child, she cursed the child, and the child was very, very traumatized with that single experience. And things like that, conflicts instilled at that very young age, when she was just 3 years old, probably manifested in her lack of bladder control. Okay, so she developed that particular symptom. So I would say the comfortable engagement with the bowel or bladder is essential to help the child basically develop control. Now, if the child, so it should be a pleasurable experience, is what Freud said. But if you do not manage to, get over that in a successful manner, according to him, you end up becoming what we call anal expulsive or anal retentive. In the child's case, she could not control it, so anal expulsive. Or those who have tight sphincter muscles, who have constipation, you call it anal retentive. So those who are anal retentive tend to be misers, or have the personality traits to become misers, whereas those who anal expulsive were considered to be verbose, like people who lecture like me. So verbose, using too much of words, being very, very ornamental in the language sort of personality. Moving on from the anal stage, the energy, or the libido, gets manifested on the phallic region. In this case, the phallus was always the male penis. So there was, in Freud's understanding, explanation in terms of what he called the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. Oedipus story, I think some of you would have heard, is the story of a young king who wanted to possess a kingdom because he wanted to marry the queen. And little did he know that he was the child, the unwanted child of that queen. And having conquered, he develops a conflict. What I must basically say at this point of time was basically to explain to you what Freud had been through. Freud was, he lost his mother very young, and his father married a very young girl who was quite of his age. And obviously, at his teenage, he had a lot of conflicts because he was sexually attracted towards her. And that conflict is perhaps why I guess he explained the transformation happening during a particular stage in terms of sexual conflict. And that I think was the reason why he explained everything in terms of sexuality. But all the same, his explanation stuck on. And he said that if the child is unable to resolve that kind of a conflict, attraction towards the mother figure, and we know naturally children cleave in terms of you have this family photos in which you have yourself being a girl sitting close to the father and the boy often sitting with the mother, and there's this inclination. So why does it happen was Freud's explanation here. And beyond that, and the same way, the girl develops an attraction towards the father because, according to Freud, I will jokingly say that you have a missing penis being a female, and obviously, trying she feels jealous because her father has it, the mother doesn't have it. That kind of a joking way of explaining phallic phallic context. But I'm saying that Freud largely described two different conflicts. And there is beyond that the stage between 7 years and puberty where there is a stage of latency. So there is basically a situation, a state of a sexuality where the person becomes very, very engaged with his own environment. He interacts with the others. He spends time with the others, and etc. So that way, the child becomes quite adjusted in the. And I think that's a time which we coincides with the late childhood, where the child interacts with the peers, irrespective of the sexual orientations. Beyond which we arrive at the next stage, which we call adolescence, or the stage called genital situation or genital stage, where the child gets attracted to the opposite sex and naturally uh, engages in heterosexual relationships. If the child is unable to, enjoy that, the child ends up having the same sex relationship. So Freud, in a very primordial way, was trying to explain how the sexual orientation or the sexuality would basically drive our personality. But for me, in simple terms, essentially it is a life energy, and this needs to be handled very, very carefully at various stages. So that is, according to Freud, the theory of psychosexual development. Now, moving from there, we will go on to the next stage, which we would say is explained by Erik Erikson. Now, Erik Erikson, if you look at this diagram, talks of various stages, as we had listed down in the different stages listed by Elizabeth Hurlock. He talks about 8 stages, okay? And during each of these 8 stages, he said there will be different conflicts. I would like you to actually spend a little time here. We will spend a little more time here to explain how this was possible and what happened. And according to Erik Erikson, each stage has certain conflicts, which are vying conflicts created by social context. So we are largely going to discuss about psychosocial theories here. Now, between the age 0 and 1, according to Erik Erikson, the child experiences, when it's born into the world, it requires attention, it requires love, it requires care and warmth. So the first tender 1 year of life requires attention from a consistent caregiver. So if there is a consistency in terms of a mother figure or a mother or a grandmother consistently caring for the child develops trust, because coming from a warmth of the mother's womb into a cold world, how much adjustment is possible is largely dependent on the kind of care given by the caregiver. So if the caregiver was consistent, the child learns to trust the person, and through the person, trust the world. Now, so if there is lack of consistency, especially we have stories of children losing their parents young, especially in 1940s with the wars, there were experiments by Spiegel where he found out that children who did not have the parental care withered and died. You just like as we said in the case of sudden infant death syndrome, there were times when the child simply failed to thrive and eventually died. So trust versus mistrust. So if you do not gain trust and affection, if you do not get affection and care, you end up having mistrustful relationships in future. So Eric Erikson talked about the importance of caregiving during the first 1 year. Now, what is the next demand, psychosocial demand during the next phase? That is between years 1 and 3. This is the time during which the child, now he has ventured out between 1 and 3, he ventures out into his immediate family and his siblings and grandparents. And there, what basically he does is, through this interaction, he basically starts to explore the world, explore the world by way of using his body. So gradually, use of your body becomes a very important activity. And through this experiments with your body, the child develops confidence. The first step that you take, or the first time you turn over, or even crawl, or even stand up, you could see the child gradually standing up and the parent like eagerly watching. And the moment the child gets up, the parent claps. The same thing with the first steps that the child makes. So a kind of encouragement from the parents and from the significant ones, the grandparents and the siblings, encourages a child to become independent. And you have you noticed ever a child, trying to brush? Have you tried to feed a child between, let's say, 1 and 2 years old? You try to feed it, what will it do? It will snatch away the spoon and then, dig into the plate, like taking a plate like that, and then it digs into the plate. And then having digged into the plate, it splatters that food on the face. Or have you taught the child to brush? Yes, the child would be rebellious. The child would snatch away the toothbrush. It will hold the toothpaste, squeeze it out until it's dripping all over, and then it aims this brush at its mouth but hits the eyes. So there is this demand on the child to become independent, autonomous, and that's what precisely the child does. And if it doesn't achieve that independence, physical independence, it experiences shame and doubt. And subsequent to that, it ventures out into play school, which is actually the next phase between 3 and 5 years, or 3 and 6 years. And it now starts to play with others. So from the house, from the peers, from the siblings, it ventures out into a new environment, which we call the school or the play school, where it interacts with the new group of friends, peers. And it is the time during which it games, it plays with things, it plays with toys, it plays with persons. A way of socialization happens there. So playing activities gives it a chance to try out new things. So initiative is what we get during that stage. And if the child is unable to, relate to others, it feels guilty, it withdraws. Just like this is a crucial state. I think for pediatricians and psychologists, it's important to see how the child is introduced into an environment. For instance, we have different children with different temperaments. There are ones who are very active, who are boisterous, who can get into a very active phase immediately. There are ones who are very sensitive. My son typically was very sensitive, and it took a lot of support from the caregiver, especially the teachers in the play school, to get him to be a more confident person. So we need to handle the temperament, and in order to give them that first opportunity to explore and then initiate association with the world. The next phase is when they move to school, and you are now prepared, because physically, in terms of your dexterity, your myelinization happening through your body, your fine motor muscles become more profound, and now you're able to write, read, and subsequently read, and then do arithmetic. So, in a way, school exercises or provides you the opportunity to experience the ways of the world in terms of preparing you for transactions in the new world. So reading, writing, and arithmetic transactions. So that's basically what is happening there. The child is equipped to transact, and then you call it industry, because it's a way of the world, the industrial world. So the 3 R's. And if the child is unable to achieve it, then the child feels inferior, not being able to communicate, not able to read, write, and do proper transaction. It affects the child. So again, there's a conflict on at that stage. Now comes a very important stage, I think, for us, the stage of identity versus role confusion. This is a stage during which the physical growth just there's a huge explosive outburst of growth, physical growth. So getting to adjust oneself, seeing oneself in the mirror, trying to understand these changes, because every day is going to be different. You have a different phase, a different tire, everything changes. So getting to adjust to that is a huge challenge, and that is what you mean by the stage called industry. Sorry, which we call identity. So this is a time during which the child explores. It tries to develop friendships. It tries to explore its own sexuality. So this exploration is what we call the formation of the identity, the failure of which leads to role confusion because it's not sure of what it is or what it's going to do. Identities in terms of your own self, in terms of what you aspire for, in terms of your future career. So education, decisions on that. These are largely influenced by this particular stage. I think I'll move on to the next slide to explain to you further. Basically, child again moves from a stage of identity diffusion where there is no idea about what it wants. Some get stuck there. Others move on to identity foreclosure, where a stage in which the child is more or less conditioned by what the parents say. And the third, called identity moratorium, where the child is totally confused because it gets stuck in the crisis that it is experiencing in terms of the new identity. And finally, the last phase being identity achievement. So Erik Erikson was far more, I mean, Erik Erikson's context of identity versus role confusion was more defined by James Marcia. For instance, what is this real aspect? Now, I had witnessed in Trivandrum in the 1980s when you find young, handsome boys standing outside the secretariat. Maybe they turn up only the evenings, the real handsome ones, hunks, we call them. Okay. And then suddenly I find them disappearing. So one post 90s, they were just missing. So when I got to work, I started to inquire where they were. And I had a friend who was an architect at the coffee house, and he was a friend, used to befriend them. So I asked him, what is happening to them? Then he said, they're all gone, they're married. I said, what happened? Well, they're married. I said, how did that happen? Because, if you looked at the life, they hardly ever aspired for anything in life. They had very successful parents who were working as a deputy secretary and secretaries of the secretariat. And these boys having a lot of assets in their native homes, they didn't want to go to work. They didn't want education. They just dressed up for the day. They will appear very handsome. You will just mistake them for one of those elite ones, but they had basically no education. But finally, when the parents retired and they came of age, so I would call that particular situation identity diffusion, where you have no idea about what we want to do, and life seems looking absolutely, there is no conflict and there is no commitment. You're just floating on. But suddenly, crisis came in because the parents retired, and they decided that it's high time these boys settle down. What do you mean by settling down? Getting married, or maybe finding a career. The parents gave them, a career. You take up this, you decide to do that, you get married. Like, unlike many of us who got married and the prescription of their parents, these guys, very few, I think they didn't never feel challenged to fall in love, marry the people they wanted. They played the safe. So that is what I mean by identity moratorium, where you foreclose your choice because your parents told you to get married or because your parents asked you to take up a particular career. You focus on that versus the next stage where you actually do not experience a decision by others, but you continue to be in the crisis, in the confusion, which we call identity moratorium. And finally, a stage during which you experience a crisis, but you arrive at a consequent, comfortable decision, and which you call a commitment. So maybe during adolescence, you would transcend these different phases and come to the final stage called identity achievement. If so, you move on to the next stage, according to Erik Erikson, and he calls it intimacy versus isolation. Now, what does he mean by intimacy? In my own understanding, intimacy, it's only about two things. One is in terms of developing an intimacy with a partner, someone whom you decide to have your life with, and deciding to have a career. So marrying into a career or marrying a partner is what you basically mean by intimacy. And through that, basically, you develop an intimacy with the ways of the world. You establish a career. You decide and bring about certain commitments towards life. And I think in the common context that we discuss about commitment is about marriage and about work. So if you do not achieve that, you experience what we call isolation, because you feel alienated from the mainstream kind of behavior. Again, I would say largely a psychosocial theory as described by Havighurst, where we call it developmental tasks. So there's this pressure, expectation that drives our behavior and development. Having transcended intimacy and adulthood, you move on to the next phase where the need is to remain generative. Bueller called it maintenance. I call in this, Erik Erikson called it in this context, generativity. Why do you call it generativity? Because whatever you earn, whatever resources you have, suddenly when you reach middle age, they seem to become inadequate, not enough. There's not enough materials or assets for you to manage on, because your children are settling down. You need to settle them, send them off. So that becomes a demand on the parent. And also in terms of marrying them off, teaching them for higher, sending them for higher education, all these things put a pressure on the parents. And on top of that, you're slowly starting to fail because of the physiological reasons, and also for the fact that you have lifestyle diseases. So being able to perform or function at the previous level of functioning despite this pressure is what you mean by generativity. So if you're able to achieve that, you achieve a stage called generativity. Otherwise, you reach a stage called stagnation. And beyond which we have the last final stage, which we call ego integrity versus despair, which is an attribute of the conflict concerning old age. Now, what is ego integrity? I remember dating back to the 2000s, when we visited an old age home in Trivandrum, close to the Trivandrum Engineering College. And interestingly, what happened there was we walked into a room where there were two women. One was an extremely, I think she was kind of healthy, but extremely grumpy. So we asked her, how was life? And she was exceptionally sarcastic and grumpy. She said, I had four children, but what's the point? I'm here. I'm just left alone in a place where I do not belong to, and they're far off. They're happy with their lives, don't care for me. And as she was explaining that, I looked around the room. There was another lady sitting across. She had a very pleasant, sweet smile on her face. So that moved me. I moved on to her gradually. And when I asked her, Amma, how are you? She said, I'm good. I'm good. Interestingly, if you didn't know, she had brittle bone disease, but she was not complaining about it. She said, anyway, see, my children are not with me, but I still have a place to stay. I get food 4 times a day, which is more than what I want. So you have in the same room a woman who's extremely grumpy, who's unhappy because of all the things in lives, and the other person who, despite her brittle bone, painful illness, continues to manage, but she manages to have a brave smile. This is exactly what I think is explained by the context what we have here: ego integrity versus despair. The first person is somebody who is in despair, living in despair, not be able to come to terms with the failures or with the bad things in life. Whereas the first person was able to come into terms, was willing to take it, take it in the right stride, look back and say, great, despite everything, see, I've been able to achieve these things, which I call is something close to what we call self-actualization, which Maslow talks about, Carl Rogers talks about in terms of self-actualization. So being able to achieve the best in life despite all these limitations. And that is largely what I think Erik Erikson meant by ego integrity. So a person who doesn't achieve that, as in the case of the second woman, is what we call despair. And they end up probably becoming ill and dying faster or a painful death. We move on to the next theory. I think this is an important theory. We'll move on to Piaget. Now, Piaget also has managed to explain the development in terms of cognition. So I think this is something that I should have started off before I explained Erik Erikson's theory. But all the same, I think it's important for us to understand the implications of this particular theory. Erik Erikson, for your information, was a very young famous, I mean, a very young. Okay. Okay, the next person I'm going to talk about is Piaget, Jean Piaget, who, in our understanding, has been able to give us a better understanding of how the human being develops in terms of cognition. Now, Piaget, as a young boy, was watching birds. He was doing a lot of watching of birds. And, this man, just like Freud, was a genius because his story is about a young boy of high intellectual abilities. And by the age of 8, that was the time during which he did his first publication in the Nature Journal. He was taken under the wing of a museum curator who observed that this boy was very interested in ornithology. So he was actually watching the white albino sparrow, and he drew the sketch, started to write down articles, and this curator helped him to file his first article by the age 8. And from that learning, he transferred the same learning that he observed in the white albino sparrow to human beings. And he arrived at what his theory would be called today the theory of cognitive development. Now, according to Piaget, development takes places in 4 stages. Note, please note that the last stage is not given by, is not the original work of Piaget. He confines it to 4 stages. Now, so let's look at these stages one by one, because this is, I think, a substantial understanding you must develop about the human development and how the cognition happens. Now, in this theory, basically, what we are going to see is how the brain, in terms of its development over the lifespan, helps us to take a better understanding of our environment. So there is this constant process of interacting, adapting to the new environment. And this learning actually conditions your brain to develop further. And so this is largely conditioned by interactions with the physical environment. Now, to start off with, between the age 0 and 2, when you're born at 0, you basically are born into life with no information. It's tabula rasa. There is no information. All you see are just like colors. For example, you remember looking at a kaleidoscope. When you turn that kaleidoscope, you have different colors manifesting. In the same way, when a child is first born and it opens its eyes after emerging from the mother's womb, that's the first time it's basically conscious about the environment. So all it sees is a lot of colors. But over a period of time, when it wets itself or when it sort of feels uncomfortable, there is a group of colors that comes to it. So before that, it was Aham Brahmasmi, I am the world. Now, over a period of time, when you see these colors approaching you, you arrive at a decision of the fact that, okay, I and another person happen to be the world, the mother. So me and my mother happens to be the world. So the first phases is what we call sensory motor stage, during which your senses are very acute. The smell of milk makes you pout and go for the nipple. The same way, the baby is highly, just I think the way Freud explained it, there is that energy in the child which is which is actually driven by the sensory experience, the colors. So I remember the famous orator Alexander Jacobs saying that you must actually help the child by at this stage by giving it a lot of colors, putting on dangling on objects with colors, things that twirl, whirl, make noises, pleasant noises, of course. So that way, getting attention is a kind of stimulation, because that is the thing that the child requires at that stage. And as a child gradually gets up, it looks around. As cephalocaudal development, it follows a pattern. It first lifts its neck, looks around, then it gradually moves its shoulders and it topples over. It starts to crawl, and then now it reaches for objects. It finds objects around us, and then it kicks at something. That object goes away. Then it realizes, okay, it's not just me. There are other objects, and I can use my body. So you have this primary circular reaction, transferring your body, using your body to transfer another object or handle another object. So understanding of the environment. Then you gradually explore still further, and you know at some stage children less than 1 or 1.5 years can guess where their mothers have hidden something. So by the time they are able to picture, imagine, or even the mother, if the mother goes away for some time, it is able to imagine, okay, the Amma is not here, mother is not here, my mother has gone somewhere, but she'll come back. So that kind of an understanding is largely what we call object permanence. This you can really see in halls, in during festivals, where you find the child dangling onto the mother's sari, and then suddenly, just letting it go, running a few paces and coming back and holding the sari again, but or the churidar, maybe whatever it is. Then the child is lets go of it, and then goes a little further, then comes back running. So she's kind of he is anchoring on this mother, and gradually, as the child, over a period of time, the child explores further and further, and maybe further and further, and it takes a peek out of the front door of the door. It goes to the next door and comes back running to that place. So that way, it expands its horizons of understanding, because it's now being able to anchor. It's able to imagine something in space without the object existing. For instance, the mother. And when the child passes through these phases, it gets prepared for the separation. So it needs to be conditioned at this stage, how the child is put into a play school and how the child gets adjusted. I told you about the temperament that needs to be adjusted, but the experience need to be given. So helping the child by gradually releasing it from the mother's clutches, introducing it to somebody whom it's more confident with, it develops what we call object permanence. Now, during the next phase, which we call from 2 to 7 years, the child basically tries to explore the environment, holding on to objects. And it's as Rousseau had said, child's work is nothing but play. What did I say? The child's work is nothing but play. And all the child does at this time is basically, during the pre-operational stage, it starts to interact, because it's very pretty to look at. Chubby cheeks, it's got pretty lips, and every baby, every chick, every puppy is very cute. So we start to engage. Seeing that person, we use gibberish language. We try to speak like as we speak to babies, and we start on speaking. It's important to engage with children. The attractiveness naturally makes you pamper them, and you have a conversation with them. You naturally drop on your knees when you see a baby, the same way. So this interaction is a way in which it actually gathers language. And through this acquisition of language, it gradually gets the confidence to speak. And it tells you wonderful stories, very, very, what should I say, very interesting, embellished stories, a lot of words coming in. It describes how it saw something very, very furious, something very scary, something very sweet. It describes things very picturesquely. So at the moment it starts to speak, you encourage it to speak, and it acquires language. So pre-operational stages during which it acquires language, and then along with language, its brain grows in such a way that it's now able to imagine. So that is when it imagines things, it tries to imitate, and then puts it into practice. So imagination and words coming together improves socialization. So that's basically what happens during the stages 2 to 7, beyond which the child now comes to what we call the concrete operational stage. Now, what happens during the concrete operational stage? As I told you earlier, it experiments with objects, it experiments with the physical environment. And just imagine if you gave a child, a car or something to play with, a car, for instance, what does the child do? In no time, he'll take it apart. Out comes the driver, off come the wheels, the windshield, the steering, everything is off. And what do we do naturally? Parents, what do? We get upset. We will tell them at what price we bought this thing. It was like 1,500 rupees, and you messed it up in 1 day. The child will look up at you and just like sit like that. Now, versus this, what I think a parent should do is maybe pack this away, keep it aside. Maybe bring it back after about a month or two later. Put the same thing before the child. The child becomes very curious because it's something it hasn't seen. Whatever it broke off earlier. It was curious. That's when it took it apart and left it there. lost its curiosity, but something new is before it then. Having seen these things, if you sit with the child and put it back together, that becomes a better education rather than, giving the child a whack. So why not consider the novelty, giving it novel experiences through which it experiences the physical environment. There's something very interesting happening there. I think Piaget has demonstrated this in videos, and also you would have seen in videos in which the child develops two concepts. One is what we call reversibility, the second being conservation. Now, for example, conservation is your understanding in terms of being able to see two objects and be aware of that quantum. For example, it's only by the stage 7 years or 6 or 5 years in our case, in our culture, because children are given an opportunity to explore, unlike in other cultures, with the grass, with the stones, with the soil, unlike in the present generation. So that kind of an exposure puts a child in a position to experience the physical world. And what happens? For example, if I gave you a tall beaker of water, tall beaker, 1 liter beaker of water, and a flat beaker of water. And if I was asked to, I was to ask you which would be bigger, the short beaker, the flat beaker, or the tall beaker, 1 liter each. If you said, as a child would say, the tall beaker is bigger, that means the child has not been able to understand the concept called volume, the third dimension, volume, time, space. So this only becomes possible when the child handles physical objects. It plays with objects, it takes it apart, it pours it in, it pours it out. So being aware of the concept volume. Similarly, if I was to put in one roll of duff, put out one roll of duff, and I roll it out into chapati. If I was to show these two objects to the child and ask the child which is bigger than the other one, maybe the child will point to the chapati rolled out and say that is bigger. That's because the child is unable to understand the concept of reversibility, that this particular object or this ball can be rolled out, and similarly the chapati could be rolled back into the ball. So the ability to understand can practice. That's exactly why children continue to play, and that is what we understand by the concept concrete operational stage. Now, as a child grows up, it experiments with the same thing at the next level, which I would say is the social context. So applying the same concepts of reversibility and conservation to human relationships is what I think is called a formal operational stage, or which enables a child to look at things very abstractly. And this coincides with teenage or puberty and adolescence, when you are able, your brain is capable of imagining about possibilities. I think this is a very crucial stage because this is what which Piaget named hypothetical deductive reasoning. And what is basically that about? I will go to the next slide. Piaget talks in terms of how a hypothetical deductive reasoning develops. Now, just imagine how many of you, I mean, including me, I think all of us have fallen in love. I think I'll tell you about my story, because if I asked you about your stories, things might not come through. But I remember as a child, as a teenager, I fell in love with somebody in campus, in college. And obviously, for me, she was everything. So I of course, introduced her to my sister, and my sister came back very softly, told me, "She and you, I don't like her." Anyway, she was my apple of my eye, so there's no point. Anyway, but I kept on. I never told I loved her. But one fine day, I took the courage and I slowly walked up to her. But when I walked up to her, I had my heart pounding. My throat was dry. I could barely speak. So I tried it twice or thrice, and she was like looking at me very curiously as to what was happening to this guy. Finally, I decided I would do it, and I walked up to her and say, I love you," and I walked away. And she went missing for the next 2 days. I didn't see a bit of her. She was absent, and I was really scared. Okay, and then what do you guess happened? She turned up the fifth day, and then she smiled at me. I thought, yeah, that this was going to be the beginning of it. But she did the worst thing any person could do to a adolescent boy. She literally disseminated me. She decimated me. What did she say? Sonny, you know what? I said, yeah, really what? You're just a brother to me. And that really shattered me. Okay. Now, coming to the text here, as an adolescent, I am now thinking about possibilities, seeing this girl, thinking about, falling in love with her, proposing with her, moving ahead in life with her, having children with her. So thinking about possibilities. But then an essential part of this to explore whether that's a reality. So I had to test my hypothesis, and I visit her, I talk to her, and I propose a hypothesis, assuming that she is in love with me, propose to her. But unfortunately, hypothesis rejected. Okay. Hypothesis, she says, okay, you're just a brother to me. My hypothesis is rejected. But there is something important happening. I am rejected. Now I think, okay, so she doesn't fit my future. How do I how do I get to her? Or how do I have to find somebody else? So you start to think about other future possibilities. You also think about your own thoughts. For instance, I juxtapose her refusal or her turning me down versus somebody else who came to me saying that, okay, Sonny, I think I love you, but I didn't show, I was not interested in her. So I see a situation in which somebody does not like me, but I like her, versus somebody who likes me, but I don't like her. So this is a way in which I start to think about my own thoughts and say, okay, what's the difference? And that way, I think about finding out somebody who's suited to my taste. And then I think about the possibilities again. So that in that way, we are able to abstract, and we do not end relationships because we understand the importance of building on relationships. So expansion of thought and the like. Okay. Coming back to Piaget's theory again, we have I think Piaget's theory talks about this ages until, let's say, 14, 15. But beyond that, there are certain contexts, although abstract, we have to understand there are contexts which are uncertain before us. So there at times decisions have to be made in a more cyclical manner. So being able to understand the system, the context holistically, and think about different possibilities, not just abstraction, but beyond that, looking at things from different angles, and then predicting, not in a linear manner, but in a cyclical manner, the outcomes. That's another level of thinking, which Labouvi we've called post-formal operational stage. Often this comes post 18 years of age. So this is according to Piaget, and subsequently according to Labouvi weave. So we have the sensory-motor stage where the senses becomes the seat of your cognition. Next stage where you use words and imagination, which we call the pre-operational stage. Then you have the concrete operational stage, during which you play with the physical world and eventually acquire reversibility and conservation. And subsequently, this concept is applied to the abstract context in terms of social relationships, which we call formal operational stage. So that's where Piaget stops, and Labouvi talks about the post-formal operational stage. Now, coming to the last theory, I think we must talk about Kohlberg. But before I talk about Kohlberg, I will tell you, Kohlberg explained that along with, as we describe the brain development according to Piaget, with brain development and the interaction with the environment, there is a possibility of human beings acquiring a sense of right and wrong. The introduction of conscience in the rudimentary form. So let's start with the story. I would like to tell you a story about four people. There used to be a pretty young adolescent girl, a maiden aged 16 going 17, pretty, and I call her Mary. She was the prettiest girl in that town. And then obviously if there's a Mary, there has to be a Joseph. Okay, so Joseph was equally handsome. tall, dark, handsome, as we say in the olden days, Mills and Boon's character. And obviously, if there is a pretty girl and a pretty boy, all of us understand they would accidentally meet each other and they will fall in love. Yes, so it was love at first bite. But then, as in the olden days, they never met each other. And it so happened that they would look at each other but never talk. So it went on and on. And finally, one day after a year, suddenly Joseph goes missing. What happens to Mary? Mary's upset because she is in love and they have their eyes looking at each other. But he's missing from the market, he's missing from the school, he's missing from the village. And obviously, she's now worried about it. So she goes on asking people as to where he is. After a long round of inquiries, she finds that from another person that he's nearly dying. He's sick and about to die. And where is he? He is now confined to his home. And the person told us says that you have to cross the river, go to the other side, turn left, turn right, take that street, and finally, when you reach there, that's the house. So she goes to the river, and standing by the river, she wants to cross. There's no way. And there's a ferryman. She walks up to him and said, "Can you take me to the other side of the river?" He says, "Fine, lady, I'll do that, but I need money." And she said, "How much?" 1 rupee. 1 rupee. Uh-huh. I don't have 1 rupee. He said, "Sorry, try again later." So she goes back. She goes home. She asks Amma, her mother, Catherine. Of course, the ferryman incident, for instance, was John. So she goes back to, Mary goes to Catherine, her mother, and tells her, "Amma, I need 1 rupee." So Catherine asks her, "What do you need that 1 rupee for?" She said, "Well, I want to go to the other side of the river." She said, "Why on the other side?" "Well, I want to meet Joseph." And she tells her the story. "I'm in love with Joseph, but Joseph is sick and is about to die, and he's the only person in my life, teenage girl, very, very infatuated or maybe in love. We don't know what it is." But the mother naturally says, "Well, I don't think that is good, but you decide." And then they end the conversation there. She goes the next day to Peter, who's the ferryman. And then so she stands by the river. She talks to Peter and tells Peter, "Peter, just try to understand. I'm desperate. I want to get to Joseph. Joseph is about to die, and that's my only way. I want to meet him before he dies." He's a practical man. He's being a very realistic man. He said, "So listen, Mary, I've been away from my family for nearly a year. It's recession, and I don't have money. I want to go home, money, but I'm also sexually frustrated. If you if you allow me to, if you sleep with me tonight, I will take you safely to the other side, and you can go and meet Joseph." So Mary was now, apprehensive. Joseph versus having sex with this ferryman, Peter. She ponders over it. She turns back and forth in her bed. And finally, as it's about 4 a.m. in the morning, she goes to Peter. He sleeps with her, and he takes Peter to the other. Peter takes her to the other side of the river, and then she waits for the dawn to break. 5:30 a.m., 5:55 a.m. She runs in. She finds the different streets. She goes and knocks on her door, and there you find pale Joseph standing. And they're like enamored to see each other. She's in tears. He's in tears. She hugs him and then tells, you know, "Joseph, how much I've been through to be with you." And then she tells the story of what happened. That frail, tall, fragile Joseph stands up, slaps her across the face, and there the story ends. Okay, there the story ends. Not that his story ended or her story ended, but my narration of the story ends. Now, my question: among these four, Mary, Joseph, Peter, and Catherine, who did wrong? Just ponder over it for a while. Is it Mary? Is it Joseph? Is it Peter or Catherine? Who did wrong? I think some of you would be thinking, okay, maybe I would say I will raise my hands, one for Peter, one for Joseph, or one for Catherine doing wrong, or one for even Peter for that matter, I want you to take a position, either one of them, just one of them. Take a moment to think who did a wrong. You need to take a position. It should be either Mary, Joseph, Peter, or even Catherine. I've made a decision. Good. If you thought Mary did wrong, I don't really know. She was in love. She gave up something very important for the person whom she loved, and she loved Joseph dearly. So, do you think she did wrong? I don't think so. If you thought that Joseph did wrong, really? Joseph did wrong? I don't think so. Do you think you would welcome your love or lover or girlfriend if she told you, or if the other way around, if he told you, I slept with somebody else because of the love for you? Obviously, Joseph was a normal human being, tired, fragile, about to die, but still, he's got pride. He's in love with her, but he has pride. So he stood up, and it was a spontaneous reaction that he slapped her across the face. I don't think he did wrong. Now you may say, well, Peter did wrong. Did he did wrong? Peter? I've found a lot of defenses where people say, he shouldn't have exploited her. She was in a bad position. And that is pretty bad that he exploited her. Well, I don't think that is his fault either. He's a practical man. He had been, cheated by a lot of girls trying to get to the other side of the river. None of them gave him money. And she didn't have money to give. So he said, let's do the barter. You don't have to pay me money. You sleep with me tonight. And he told her about the pros and cons of it, and she decided. So I don't think Peter did wrong. Maybe then you'll say Catherine did wrong. Well, Catherine and wrong. What wrong did Catherine do? She was a mother. She knows a teenager. The moment you say no to them, they'll just do that. They'll just do what you say don't do. You ask them to close the door, they'll open the door. That's normal. And so she was very mature. She said, dear one, if you had something on between you and Peter, something might happen to you. But it's ultimately your decision. Because if you love that person, I think if that's more important, maybe you have to give up something more important for Joseph. So that way, I would say, if you noticed here, I think all of us ended up pointing fingers at one or maybe two, because I didn't permit you to do that. We end up pointing fingers. But the moment we point finger at somebody, remember there are three fingers pointing back at you. So can we not think about a position where I would argue that either all of them did wrong, or maybe still better, none of them did wrong. Okay, so we have three positions here, either saying that, okay, one of them did wrong, or saying that none of them did wrong, or then saying all of them did wrong. And that is exactly what Kohlberg tried to experiment and find out. Kohlberg suggested that, what do you mean by morality is how we construct it over a period of time. Morality is constructed by your interactions with various people, various stages. Now, for instance, according to Kohlberg, there are three major stages, followed by two substages. Each of these followed by two substages. The first stage is what, according to Kohlberg, was the pre-conventional morality. The second was conventional morality. Third being post-conventional morality. And what do you mean by pre-conventional morality? Pre-conventional morality is the self-focused morality, because you are a child, you are so focused on yourself, you're thinking only about yourself. That preoccupation, because you have limited experiences and you are pampered by the parents. So you have limited self-focused morality. In the next phase, when you move from your home to school, you're interacting with the peers. Obviously, it becomes guided. Your morality, your right and wrong, being differentiated by them. That's why we call it the other focused morality. And the last level is what you mean by post-conventional morality, where you end up having a perspective beyond the others. Others don't matter because you are a lot more mature. You've seen the world. And that's exactly sometimes, as we concluded in the previous exercise, when we would probably say, well, I don't think so. Nobody did wrong. Because it's the circumstances that force them into it. There's this famous singer, Sting, who was the part of the band Police, who said that it could be you in another life. It could be Peter. You could be Peter in another life. You could be Mary in another life. Could be Catherine in another life. Maybe circumstances would force us into these particular contexts. If so, then we do not blame anybody. So that is exactly what higher focus morality is about. And that is exactly what the universe, the substage under post-conventional morality, titled Universal Ethical Principle of Morality, is all about. We do not place the blame because you're convinced that it is circumstances. People need to exercise their own discretion about realities. And that is exactly what the higher focus morality is about, especially the universal ethical principle of morality. Now, going back, let's look at the pre-conventional morality stage. In the pre-conventional morality, the individual is basically, guided by the parents for wrong and right. I remember as a child standing because in a village where the fire used to come down from mountain to mountain, and it was about it advanced two mountains close to our house, and there was a field beyond which my school stood, which was made of wood, and beyond that, two mountains. I could see the fire coming down. So my mother said, drop down on your knees, pray hard that it rains. I prayed hard for 2 days. Third day it rained. So my mother said, see, you did good and God has rewarded you. So our morality is largely guided by others to begin with. And your mother would tell you, if you did wrong, you will be punished, you will be sent to hell. You do good, you're saved, you go to heaven. Likewise. So that is what you mean by punishment, obedience, orientation. Whereas as time passes, you gradually decide, or from experience, you understand your parents are taking you for a ride, or that is the kind of understanding you develop because you become more focused in terms of your pleasures. I call it naive hedonistic orientation, where my pleasure of getting pleasure is considered right and pain is considered wrong. So given this particular aspect, I will bargain. I will, for example, if my dad or mom ask me to do something, I will say, what do I get in exchange? Do I get to see a movie? Do I get an ice cream? So that kind of negotiation happens. So goodness is in terms of what you experience as pleasure, and badness is in terms of what you experience in terms of pain. Right. So this is perhaps the time during which maybe we are you should be permitted to use sort of punishment in terms of physical minor punishments to help children understand right and wrong. But beyond that, as the child advances beyond 5 years or 7 years, you should understand that the child is gradually now turning away from the family onto the others, then impressing the peers. In conventional morality, it becomes impressing the others. To begin with, your right and wrong is dictated, especially during adolescence, by what your friends do, the hairstyles they wear, the dress they wear, the bags they wear, the things they do, sex, drugs, whatever it is. So they become your morality, the good boy, good girl orientation, because you need to impress them. And as you grow a little older, there is also a more broader thinking, as we said in the case of abstraction, formal operational thought, where you look at the possibilities and you look about abstracting in terms of experiences. And there you have idealism. For example, if you see an issue, you look at the pros and cons of it. You look at the ideal position. And then, for example, many times we take positions on idealism. You challenge because you thought it was the right thing to do, because there was a value behind that, which is often misplaced. So that idealism is very, very common among adolescents, especially the youth. And that is exactly why the political parties or even misguided groups get you into drugs, into terrorism, into sex, and things like that. Idealism. And beyond that age, with experience, you also try to understand uncertainties in life, and you become pragmatic. practical. So you do a little give and take in terms of morality. There is a bargain, but largely you look at the benefit for everybody. And that is what you mean by the social contract or legalistic orientation. So in this way, according to Kohlberg, there would be a transition in terms of your understanding of morality. I will come to the last theory, which again would tell you about how human beings develop in terms of their engagement with the world or the world of work, which we call career. According to Ginsberg, Axelrod, and Herma, basically a person goes through three phases, right? Until the age of 12, all of us explored very, very fantastic options, becoming a cowboy, becoming a pilot, becoming a firefighter, becoming a popsicle ice cream wine seller, vendor, ice cream vendor. So you have different, very idealistic positions. So basically, this phase is called a fantasy phase, where you actually do a lot of role playing, seeing what you think, imitate, and see what suits you. You try a lot of different options. There's also something called avocation, which is something that you basically do. Because I remember my sister, as a child, she had close cropped her hair, but she would wear a towel and then, roll it up as if she had a long braided hair. And she had a stick because my parents were teachers. She had a stick. She would cane the boxes which we had packed for us to migrate, and there was a blackboard. So these things, you experiment with some of these things which are close to your heart. That is what we call a fantasy stage, which is very common. But beyond the fantasy stage, you gradually explore deeper. You eventually transcend these, and you come to 2 or 3 different areas which are quite similar. You test them for various aspects. I would say first begins, you test it in terms of your interest, in terms of your aptitude. Then you test in terms of your capacities, all right, and skill sets that you have. So maybe as a person who used to draw quite well, I wanted to become an architect because I thought that skills matched. And I was also interested in building houses. And also the value systems with each, there is definitely the blue collar, white collar kind of classification. The values that really, values largely a reflection of your culture, your background, and how much it matches. So all these things are considered, and then you gradually sieve out. You sort of gradually from this entire fantasy things, you pick up on a few, and based on these various traits or parameters, you evaluate it. And gradually in the West, basically, kids get an opportunity to go to do summer work. They work and then try in reality. All right. So that there is a way of testing. Okay. And they also understand the consequences and responsibility that goes with the work as they go on. And they come to the final stage, which we call the realistic phase beyond 17 years, where you go into the real world and try to see how much this work. You become very clear in terms of the choice and try to get the appropriate education and skills and abilities which are in the formal system of education. So that way you explore it further and you reach a situation called crystallization, where you more or less decide on a choice, and finally you end up specifying or getting into that totally. So this is largely a pattern that is followed in terms of transition during the various phases from fantasy to a stage called tentative, where more or less a decision is made, and finally a consolidation, which we call the realistic phase, during which you basically explore. Having explored, you crystallize, you focus, and you put in more effort in the formal education system to acquire those skills, knowledge, and abilities. And finally, you end up taking that job up, which we call specification. Against this, you must also think that there is a possibility of challenging, because in the modern day we find people shifting careers. So this does not apply in all the contexts, but there is a possibility of this working it out. On the large, it does exist. But we find, I visited one of my former professors, George Matthew, and he said, well, I don't believe, because I took one of my students to actually, when she was interested in becoming a career counselor, he said, I don't believe it any longer, because kids change their professions. You find somebody in Technopark giving it up taking up to culinary work, or somebody giving up on that, take up startups, or women typically who are homemakers all the while, taking to catering and then getting to good businesses. So there is a huge possibility of social mobility to challenge all these theories. In the same way, I just would like you to understand that perhaps sometimes a lot of the theories might not even work. And that is why when you look at theories, you need to look at the flip side. Freud, for instance, when he started off, talked about psychosexual theory, but he doesn't define it beyond 14 years. And when you look at Kohlberg, his example of experiments was basically focused on men. A typical case, he asked if a wife was about to die, if you knew you had a medication and you had to buy it, and the person would refuse to sell it, what will you do? So there will be a perspective from a male who would say, I will steal, I will force the man, beat him up, and get the medicine. That is a typically male perspective. But as a female would say, I would appeal to the person, talk about it, give him the reasons, and get the medicine for my husband. So there are cultural gender issues perhaps playing in when you explain these theories. Erik Erikson's theory is largely unchallenged. So is Piaget's theory, because it definitely explains a lot of this human development in the cognitive dimension. It also has some basis because it has clear explanation in terms of the neurophysiological changes happening and the subsequent ability to abstract and apply hypothetical deductive reasoning. The same way, Manudharma Shastra also explains the broad transition across these four stages. So I think I've explained you in what I've started on the beginning was to help you to understand, number one, what is developmental psychology, the study of the intra-individual changes and the inter-individual changes happening within this intra-individual changes. So the lifespan changes. We talked about developmental tasks, which are social expectations, which are forced by the society. I would say this has been the focus for the psychosocial explanation to human development. And so there are certain tasks which are expected to be achieved, the satisfaction of which leads to satisfaction, happiness, and success in the next phases, whereas a failure can lead to disappointment and doubt about the next phase. Then we discussed the characteristics of development. We looked at the different life stages and the corresponding developmental tasks. Then we visited the theory by Manudharma Shastra. We looked at the European way of five-stage theory by Bueller. We went on to look at Freud, who looked at the psychosexual development, which I thought was flawed, but there are a lot of genius in it. And also, he has actually helped us to understand what the mind was all about. Subsequent to that, we discussed Erik Erikson. He talks about 8 stages and the various conflicts manifesting at the different stages. And following which, we looked at Piaget, who talked about 4 stages. And finally, we came to Kohlberg's theory of morality development. And beyond that, of course, Ginsberg's theory on career development. So I thank you for your patience and your kind listening. I'm sorry that we had to do this on video because there was a constraint where I could not avoid a particular meeting. It was mandated for me to attend that meeting. I could not take leave and come out of it. I apologize, but I stand by for questions from you. Thank you so much.